1849, news of the discovery of gold in California spread throughout the world, bringing hundreds of thousands of people to Sacramento City. Lured by accounts of gold nuggets lying in the streets, the Sacramento River quickly became a highway of boats and ships filled with adventurers and fortune seekers. Some came by land, but most came by sea, making the last leg of the trip from San Francisco to the landing at Sacramento, arriving at the closest point to the gold fields. By 1850, the river had become a floating city of hulks, serving as warehouses, hotels, or offices for the town's business operations. This replica storeship Globe, docked in Old Sacramento State Historic Park, symbolizes the spirit of the boomtown waterfront. For at least 20 years, these storeships played a very important role in the rapid growth of the city.
Archaeologists to date have discovered 3 Gold Rush-era shipwrecks in the Sacramento River. The first to be discovered just 3 years ago stands at the foot of J Street and is most probably the small brig Sterling, an 1849 arrival which served as a storeship and as a floating steamer landing until she sank in 1855. Down at the foot of S Street lie the remains of another vessel discovered just 2 years ago. That vessel, most probably, is the Gold Rush bark Ninus, which also arrived in 1849 and lasted for more than 2 decades until she was finally broken up and sunk at the foot of S Street in the late 1860s. Finally, the first vessel to actually be located, but not archaeologically, being discovered by telephone dredging in 1972, is now the focus of archaeological study. This vessel, presumed to be the Gold Rush prison bark LaGrange, was a very fascinating vessel and perhaps the most famous of Sacramento's Gold Rush storeships. Old Sacramento is now being reconstructed. Archaeologists and historians working together with the California Department of Parks and Recreation have transformed the record beneath the soil of Old Sacramento into a living, breathing replica of the city that was here in the 1850s. That work is continuing, but really is nearing completion. Work is now focusing on the Sacramento riverfront. As you sit here in the storeship Globe, one of the most fascinating things to realize is that 30 feet below us, sitting on the bottom of the river, lie the remains of many of the vessels which came here in 1849. The pioneer storeships, which either were broken up years after their use had ended, or which sank during the height of their careers, lie entombed in the mud, in the sand, and in the silt of the Sacramento River. And archaeologists and historians working together once again are beginning to uncover the remains of these vessels and learn more about the past. As an archaeologist descends beneath the waters of the Sacramento River, time stands still. Excavators often find, as they work with these ships and they look at the remarkable preservation and the integrity of what they see on the bottom, that they're looking at a time capsule. It's as if, in the words of one Egyptian archaeologist, time had indeed stood still. And the feeling of the archaeologist descending through the murk of the river is nearly identical to that of the Egyptian archaeologist who, in breaching the tomb, still finds the footprints of those who had departed and the dried and wilted flowers left by mourners 3,000 years before. It is as if 3,000 years have passed, but perhaps only 3 seconds. You are one with those who were here, and their experience becomes your experience.
Underwater archaeologist Jack Hunter will serve as dive master for the 5-member archaeological dive team. Together with state underwater archaeologist John Foster, the 2 divers prepare to tour the underwater site. They will dive down to about 25 feet where the archaeologists have located the wreckage of the LaGrange. During the 6-week investigation, over 100 hours will have been spent underwater mapping the wreckage of LaGrange. Although the archaeologists are very experienced in underwater surveys, rapid and shifting currents, poor visibility, and cold temperatures make their work very difficult.
It's not a good place to dive because it is extremely dangerous. The bottom is basically a compilation of silts and gravels and clays of various thicknesses that are interspaced with trees and branches and bushes and barbed wire and fishing line and anchor ropes, and it's quite a tangled mess. You don't move too far without having to stop and untangle yourself from something. It's an alien environment, and you're a visitor there, and it's the kind of thing where you want to have all of the surface support that you need to do the job you're going to do. In our case here, we have safety diver on station every time the diver's in the water. Nonetheless, there are things here which are historic, and we're going to map them and analyze them and figure out what their cultural value is to the modern time.
Turning to historian Dr. Joseph McGowan, Professor Emeritus of the California State University at Sacramento, nautical archaeologist and researcher Stephen James poses questions to help gain an understanding of the importance of the LaGrange site.
Why was transportation such a critical factor to the development of early California?
Without transportation, every region or every area has to subsist entirely on what they produce. California, when it was occupied by Americans, had only about 10,000 residents. After 2 years, it had about 120,000. They were unable to feed, clothe, or supply the people that came in the gold rush. Therefore, the freight had to be brought into California, and it came from the East Coast around the Horn on a 5-month trip, and then up the Sacramento River. Without these supplies, it would have been impossible for the people to subsist in the gold rush.
Can you give us a chronology of the evolution of the ship types and the freight and the people that it brought?
Well, at first it was the sailing ships, because California was still a frontier community in 1847. There was a pioneer steamboat in 1847, but it could only carry 10 people. It did get to Sacramento, but it took, I think, 7 days from San Francisco. And so we had to rely on sailing ships to provide the supplies for the people in the mines. Coming up the river was a difficult process, because using wind entirely, and there were tall trees lining the river, and the river was swinging back and forth. It sometimes took them 5 weeks to get up the river. On occasions, they even took a rope and tied it from the sailing ship upriver around a tree, and then everyone aboard the ship had to pull the ship up to where it could get some wind again. And wooden ships were fairly small, as is demonstrated by the globe down there. And so goods were quite expensive, and supplies were inadequate until the steamboats began to come. The first steamboat, big steamboat, arrived in October of 1849. Prior to that, we had little, they called them steam scows, pony power on the river. But they didn't operate in the bay. They operated primarily between Benicia and Marysville. But when the big steamboats came, starting in October and December of 1849, then the first of these ships, the Senator, not the McKim was first, but the Senator was the one who became permanent, carried 300 tons of freight and about 300 people, and could make 3 round trips a week, which was the equivalent of, what, 10, 15, 20 sailing ships. And it was the introduction of the steamboat then that oversupplied the mines, you might say, so that by 1853 we had an oversupply of goods. Incidentally, that first steamboat supposedly, well, it charged $30 a person and $30 a ton, and it supposedly made $50,000 net profit a month for the first year.
For many, the prosperity of the California gold rush was not found in the gold fields, but in selling the scarce supplies needed by the miners. Historian James Henley tells us of the mercantile city that grew at the very doorstep of Sutter's Fort, a city designed by Captain John Warner, an engineer hired by the son of John Sutter.
Captain Warner laid out a city very much on what I guess I would call an American model. This is not a fortified European city we're talking about. In fact, no basic defensive system at all. It was a commercial mercantile city. It was laid out on a regular grid system, the grid being letters and numbers, and it was not laid out with an interest in fortifiable holdings. It was laid out in relation to the river. The river was the reason for the grid and the pattern for the city. In fact, Warner laid it a little bit off of true north so that the streets align better with the river frontage. The first things going in the waterfront were to supply the interchange with the boats. You get banking, you get supply stores. It's hard to classify them what they are. They called themselves miners' supply stores because they'd handle whatever they could get. It wasn't like they were a dry goods merchant or they were a grocer or whatever. They'd handle anything and everything that came through the doors that they could sell. These things were all there to make that point of interchange between the ships and the land. And the reason that's so important at this time is everything essentially that serves the gold rush, the fuel for the gold rush, comes by ship to California. The overland experience is minimal in terms of supplies. And sure, a lot of people come overland, but almost all supplies to the mines begins and arrives by ship.
During the third week of the survey, 2 major sections of the hull are identified by the archaeologists, including a section of the ship's keel.
That's 30, let's see, this is 35 and that's 42, so that's
42
7 feet. That's
7
all
feet.
we've got, is 7 feet.
You've only got 7 feet of midships here? And then there's...
No, we've got
That's not a
7
midship.
foot, but
We have 21 feet of this
actually
one.
we have more at the top. We come over,
Oh, I see,
however,
but this is
our
the only section.
riprap comes like this. We have more over here on our exposed upper hull with the deck area exposed this way, downstream. We're sitting like this. Here's the keel, down bank.
Right.
This is coming up, almost
Right.
vertical right here, and then
It is vertical.
Yeah.
this is downstream a ways, and we've attached this. Let's see,
There's
here's our
the
scupper. The scupper actually, I'm not sure if this is smash flat, but here's our distance of our.
They're not round usually,
Yeah.
they are ovoid.
Yeah, they're ovoid.
What we've got is we've got a very two-dimensional idea of what this ship looks like now. We're looking straight down on it in the drawings and the measurements we're making. The idea now is to make this a three-dimensional entity. So using this tool, what we're going to do is try to develop a cross-section of the ship. In other words, the ship's hull originally had a curve to it with the keel and the keelson sitting sort of in the center as a backbone. The idea of this device is measuring from this point to this point, getting the angle at a level by taking a set of measurements in this way and form, moving along. What we can do is project this curve with the side of the hull. So what is two-dimensional becomes three-dimensional.
Yeah. This view right here is looking down on this section of hull. It looks flat here, but in essence, it's extremely curved.
We're trying to collect information that will tell us eventually whether we have the LaGrange, one task we're trying to do, and the second is tell us how the LaGrange was built. Because even though a model exists, not very much is known about her. So we take information such as the size of the frames, which are like the ribs of a ship. We'll take information about the planking and the way it was fastened. And each of these things will be recorded, so sizes will all be recorded, and spacing, and all of this will eventually come together and probably produce some type of ship drawing.
After planning where and how measurements will be taken, the archaeological divers descend to the river bottom, removing their fins to minimize disturbing the fluffy silt that settles daily over the wreck. Besides measuring the length, width, and thickness of each vessel fragment, the original design of the ship is reconstructed by measuring sections of the wreck which are no longer connected. Using a level, protractor, and measuring tape, curves still evident in the planking of the vessel's lower hull are recorded. Each diver is assigned to hold the level square at the reference point, run the tape to its designated location, or swim between, recording numbers as the whole activity struggles to hold its position steady in the sometimes excessive current. The geometry of the LaGrange, as conceived in the minds of her builders some century and a half ago, can now be used to recapture in drawings the nautical construction found in the design of the hull, which has been lost over time. Information gained from the thousands of measurements taken by the archaeologist indicates that two major portions of the hull which have been found probably represent 1/2 of the keel and 1/3 of the port and starboard sections of the vessel, which originally measured approximately 96 feet in length. Split apart sometime between 1868 and 1972, when the vessel was first located by dredging equipment, the upbank section of the hull sits on the 1860 river bottom in about 12 feet of water, with the lower half fallen away, lying directly below in about 25 feet of water. Just a few feet downstream, sitting at the approximate level of the deck of the upstream section, is a large beam with evenly spaced ring bolts. This may reflect the prison activity known to have taken place aboard LaGrange.
We gotta, if we move in one direction, we can't come back for a pan.
I'm gonna go try and find the bees.
Oh, okay.
As part of the underwater mapping process, the archaeologists have numbered and tagged each timber associated with the wreck site. The upbank wreckage pictured here is the starboard half of the hull. This form of mapping provides critical details for comparison with known documents regarding LaGrange. The downbank section is of great interest to the archaeologists, since among the timbers are deck knees and notches in the shelf clamps, revealing the position of the main deck. The archaeologist will also use videotape to document specific details of the underwater site. The video record will be studied further for construction details, as it captures images in low visibility more clearly than a still camera. Bright yellow guidelines have been placed over the entire site to aid the underwater archaeologist as they descend in visibility, which varies from 6 inches to 2 feet. These safety lines enable divers to relocate various sections of the wreck, which are numbered and tagged for provenience. The baseline follows the length of the keel. The numbered frames leading out from the keel are made of oak and are evenly spaced and rise in a tight V shape, revealing that this was once a deep-hulled vessel designed for ocean-going travel. Archaeologists were surprised to find that the ship is intact up to the level of her main deck. The hull was originally lined with interior planking, which in some places still exists. Where it no longer remains, we are able to see tightly spaced frames called futtocks, which continue the curvature of the ship up to the level of the deck. In places, huge boulders have fallen down onto the wreck, making it difficult for the archaeologists to reach certain portions of the ship for further study. Dredging of the early 1970s, which tore open the hull of the vessel, has left certain features of the ship's construction exposed. We can see here copper sheathing over a layer of tarred felt, which once covered the entire outer hull to provide protection from wood-boring worms found in the ocean. This small metal plate was used by the shipwright to strap the shoe, upper, and main keel sections together. Several feet downstream, sitting at about the level of the deck, is a beam protruding from the riverbank with evenly spaced ring bolts, a reminder of the time when LaGrange served as the city's prison. For nearly a decade, beginning in 1850, LaGrange remained in service, moored in the river near I Street until November 18, 1859, when she sank during a storm. Of the 764 vessels recorded as sailing to California in 1849, only a handful are left as archaeological sites. What remains of LaGrange is more than the remnants of a ship. These timbers represent an important tie to the past, not only of Sacramento, but of a tie to the maritime past of the American seafaring tradition, something which is largely forgotten and lost today. The LaGrange, built in 1835, is one of the oldest structures still surviving in the city of Sacramento. Remarkably, she has remained pinned in place for over 130 years, a witness to the story of gold and ships and of the men and women who built the River City. On display at the Hastings Museum in Old Sacramento is an Admiralty anchor dated 1844, found in the river near the LaGrange site. Archaeologist John Foster sees the LaGrange project as a rare opportunity to retrieve the fabric of the past and to present it to the public as part of the old Sacramento waterfront.
This particular project is a very important one for the Department of Parks and Recreation, inasmuch as it entails a segment of the waterfront which is devoted to interpreting the early period of Sacramento's history up until 1860, at the time of the railroad and so on. We're trying to give people a sense of the earliest history of Sacramento, the time Sutter came, and even before that, up to the coming of the Gold Rush ships. We've had overwhelming support down through the years for the preservation and interpretation of the Gold Rush history here in Sacramento. And in that sense, I think Sacramento may be unique, or at least it's a tremendous example of such public concern for its historic past. The LaGrange site specifically is slated to become a natural-looking bank. They're going to remove the visible riprap to plant trees along the waterline so that people will have a sense of what the early Sacramento waterfront looked like prior to the construction of levees, flood walls, and so on. In the course of preparing to reconstruct Sacramento's waterfront, we discovered one of the significant vestiges of that past in the form of this LaGrange site. And now we're facing the dilemma of how to preserve history and restore history at the same time, and how to deal with this very significant Gold Rush shipwreck just below the I Street Bridge on the Sacramento River. We think of the Gold Rush time as being not that long ago, and of course it isn't that long ago. But in terms of physical objects, the physical legacy of the Gold Rush, a very small amount of actual material and sites and objects have survived. Ultimately, I would like to see one of these wrecks actually raised, if not the LaGrange, then one of the other wrecks, so that people could actually see the remains of a Gold Rush ship. These are really quite exciting, and they are unique in California. Nowhere else can you go and see a Gold Rush ship on exhibit. Here in Sacramento, we have a number of them to select from, in which we could somehow build a museum around the ship itself and thereby tell the full story of the Gold Rush pioneers that came here. In a sense, the story of the LaGrange, her coming to California, and the aspirations of the company that bought and outfitted her are a microcosm of the story of the Gold Rush itself. For example, the details that have survived in historical records include one of the songs which was sung during her passage around the Horn. And this obviously served to keep people's spirits up at the time. If I may, I'd like to sing a little bit of this song. I came from Salem City with my washbowl on my knee. I'm going to California, the gold dust for to see. It seemed all right the day I left. The weather it was dry. The sun so hot I froze to death. Oh, brothers, don't you cry. Oh, California, that's the land for me. I'm going to Sacramento with my washbowl on my knee. I jumped aboard the Liza ship and traveled on the sea. And every time I thought of home, I wished it wasn't me. The vessel reared like any horse. It had oats of wealth. I found it couldn't throw me, so I thought I'd throw myself. I'll soon be in Frisco, and then I'll look around. And when I see the gold lumps there, I'll pick them off the ground. I'll scrape the mountains clean. I'll drain the rivers dry. A pocket full of rocks brung home, so brothers, don't you cry. Oh, California, that's the land for me. I'm going to Sacramento with my washbowl on my knee.